And basically, we're going to talk about the bind event function and its cousins, access and assign. And there's not much to say about this slide. And Todd said an awful lot about this one. I'm Tamar Granor, and I've been writing about FoxPro, working with it. I was realizing I've been working with Fox products for coming up on 25 years and writing about it, speaking about it. One of the authors of the forthcoming VFPX open source treasure for the VFP developer. Forthcoming soon, we hope. So let's go on and get started. This is the agenda. I'll talk about bind event for a while, give lots of examples. And in fact, this is very much an examples session. I'm going to give you the overview on these things, the summary, and then I'm going to just show lots of ways that I use them and that you can use them. So bind event first, then we'll talk about access methods, then assign methods, and then briefly at the end, a little bit about issues around debugging this stuff. In order to have something to demonstrate with, I'm going to use an application that I actually originally wrote for the very last Great Lakes conference. It was originally written to demonstrate lots of user interface techniques. And when I was putting this session together and trying to think about how to demo the example, what examples, I realized it already had lots of uses of these techniques in it. So I fleshed out, added a few more, and this is the demo. So the application is meant to be a fairly simple example of what you might have for a public library: checkbooks in, checkbooks out, have a catalog, be able to maintain the catalog, have a set of members, and so forth. And you'll see it as we go, but this slide gives you a little bit of an example. So what is bind event? It's a function, and it's a function that lets us connect two events, or two methods, really. There are two objects involved in bind event. One object is the event source. It's the one that has an event that fires. The other object is the event handler. It's an object that has some method that we're going to use. They can be the same object. And in fact, in a lot of my examples, they are. So the idea is that the event source, that object, has some event that we call the bound event. And when the bound event fires, the delegate method of the event handler will fire, and then the bound event will fire. So basically, we're tying these two methods together so that whenever the bound event occurs naturally, the delegate method will run, and then the code in the bound event will run. Now, you can actually change that order. There's a fifth parameter I'm not showing on the slide. If you parameter, then the bound event code will fire first, method fires. And there turn out to be some times when that's really handy. And we'll see some examples in the session. There are 4 functions in VFP that are related to event binding. Bind event I already talked about. Unbind events, as you would expect, releases the binding. I don't use it a lot because when either of the objects involved goes out of scope, the binding ends. But there are times when unbind events is useful. A events, it's one of that family of A functions where it fills an array with something. In this case, it fills an array with information about what events are bound. And we'll see some examples of that as we go. Probably the hardest to understand here is raise event. What it does is allow you to fire an event programmatically. Rather than just calling the method, when you use raise event, from VFP's internals sees that as an event firing rather than just a call to an event. And although I'm not actually demonstrating it here, there is another way parameter. It's actually part of the 5th parameter for bind event that lets you determine whether the binding is effective all the time or only when the event occurs as an event, not as a call to the method. As I say, raise event's a little tricky. I want to jump now into examples. The first thing I thought of when we got bind event back in VFP 8 was context menus. One of the things that I've always thought is a hassle is when you want to have some kind of centralized control over context menus, right-click menus, it's annoying. You need code in every right-click. But instead, what you can do is you can bind the right-click of every control to the form's right-click so that then the form's right-click method handles it all for you. And let me first. Do I have to click on that and then click here? Trying to figure out how I. Okay, you should, as soon as it's being a window, which is this application running, this library application.
Yeah, we've got the application now.
Awesome. All right, and I meant to have this open and set up beforehand, but got distracted a little. All right, so this is the checkout form, and I'm going to choose member, and then I'm going to do this. This application was designed with the notion that you'd be using barcodes, but for simplicity, I'm going to cheat this in how I add a book, and I'm going to just drag this over here. We'll talk about that drag in a few minutes, but what I want to show you is, all right, so here we have the checkout form. We have a borrower listed at the top and the list of books at the bottom. If I right click at the top here, I get, and I don't know if you can see it because, are you seeing the right click menu?
Yeah, show this member's record.
Great, okay. So when I do it up here, it says show this member's record. But if I come down here over the item in the grid, I also get show book in catalog. That's the whole point of a context menu. It gives you context. So let me also point out, when I right click over the control, I'm still getting the right stuff even though I'm not over the form. So how's that all working? Okay, so here we are in VFP, and we're going to take a look first in, I'm going to just open one of these. These are the base classes for this application. And if I take a look at the init method of this checkbox, it contains this line, bind event, this right-click, this form right-click. In other words, every time the right-click method of the checkbox fires, run the right-click method of the form. And all of the base classes contain basically the same code. That, in fact, exactly the same code. In the init method of each of these first level subclasses, we have that code. Then at the form level, the base class in the right-click method just calls a method, a custom method called show menu. Show menu, I should have said this before, this is all based on something that Doug published back in 1997 in Fox Talk. Very nice, elegant way of managing context menus. And I adopted it, and I like it enough that I haven't bothered to try anything different. Ignore the part, this first part, it's to work around a FoxPro issue. But we get down here, and here's our first use of A events. I call A events because I want to find out, how did I get here? And when you pass the array, but when you pass 0 as the second parameter A events, it fills the array with information about what got you here. and it returns the number of rows in the array as so many of the A functions do. So if it returns 0, that means it wasn't a bound event that got us here. Therefore, the user must have actually right-clicked right on the form. But if it's non-zero, then we know that it was the first element of the array is the object that got us here. So we find out who got us here. Then set up the shortcut menu, just a pop-up, and then there's another method that's abstract at this level that actually populates that pop-up. And then we go ahead and activate it. So the shortcut menu method here in the base class, as I say, it's abstract. There's nothing there. But if we go look at the checkout form, there'll be code there, and we don't really need to dig into it. Just to show you, we pass in what object it was that was actually right-clicked, and then we just build the pop-up with define bar and on selection bar commands, paying attention to where were we, what is the context. So the lower part here is what's figuring out, are we over the grid, and are we actually over some kind of a record, and if we're in the grid, add the bar for showing the book. So what the binding of the right-click method bought me was the ability to put all the code to build the shortcut menu in one place, instead of having it scattered all over my application. Okay. So, next example, handling events inside a container. One of the major applications that I've been working on for quite a few years now is very graphical. Some of you may have seen it at Southwest Fox, and there have been a few images from it in various articles that I've written. But one of the things going on there is that I have containers that represent real-world objects. And so the containers contain shapes and labels and other containers. But from the user's point of view, it's just this one thing. So they want any action they take on that container or on any of the controls inside the container to behave the same way. So we can bind the click, double click, and mouse down of the controls inside a container to the corresponding events of the container. And what that does, as the slide says, is make the container transparent to the user. And when we're talking about mouse down, if we have drag and drop, it lets the drag and drop start anywhere inside the container. So let me switch over and demo this. I actually did demo it already, incidentally. Let me reopen that catalog. On this page, I can drag from anywhere, make it really obvious. I'm over this edit box. I can drag and I can drop it into the grid. Even though it wasn't the page itself, there's a container on this page, and anywhere in the container, no matter which control I'm over, I can just do the drag and drop. So what's going on here? Well, let's actually look at the base container class. And first I want to look at properties. The class has several properties, several custom properties: L-bind click, L-bind double click, L-bind mouse down. Each one controls whether we're going to bind the corresponding method of the controls inside the container to the container. Then in the init method of the container, we have some fairly simple code. There's that right click we already looked at, but then if this .lbind double click. If we've said that double clicks inside this container should be bound to the container, call a method, this .bind double click, and pass the control itself as a parameter. And then we have corresponding code for mouse down and for click. And what do those methods look like? Well, here's bind double click. It receives a container or an object as a parameter. And then we loop through the object's collection of the parameter. And if the object within the container has a double click method, PEM status of whatever, comma 5 means does this method or property exist? So if it has a double click method, then call bind event to bind the object's double click method to the container's double click method. But we might have containers inside containers. So if the object we're currently looking at has an object's property of its own, then recursively call this method passing that object. Let me stop at this moment because recursion sometimes is confusing and see whether there are any questions. So I'm going to unmute and.
The conference is now in conversation mode.
Any questions about this code? Okay. I'll mute you again.
The conference is now in presentation mode.
Okay. By the way, I realized when I first started giving this presentation that instead of having separate bind click, bind double click, bind mouse down methods, I could have a method called bind method and pass in both the container and the name of the method, but I didn't bother to change it. All right, so that's the second use of this stuff, of binding. And again, notice this is all stuff that we're setting up in our base classes so that when we use them, all we have to do is set a few properties and it behaves the way we want. Okay, this one I think is really nice. I mean, I think they're all nice, but this one in particular. I like using applications that are smart and that pay attention to what I'm doing. One of the things that is pretty common in applications is that the menus and the toolbars know what you're doing and are appropriately enabled and disabled. You can use event binding to make your application behave the same way. As the slide says, bind the interactive change and programmatic change of controls to a method at the form level and let that method at the form level figure out what should be enabled and disabled in the menu and the toolbars. So let's go ahead and look at an example of that. Close a couple of windows here and open something different. Here's the borrower form in this application. And first, notice that it remembered who I was last looking at. That was part of the good user interface stuff I designed into this. But notice that right now, on the main toolbar, the only things that are enabled are the new button and the copy button. When I click new, interestingly, paste comes alive, but still save and undo aren't available. But when I come in and I start typing, as soon as I type part of a name, save and undo became available. Okay, and in fact, if I now hit undo, it goes back. And you might have questions about whether I've made the right choices of what should be enabled and disabled. But the idea is, as soon as I acted, it changed. And I guess I ought to show you, by the way, that the menu is the same thing. Right now, new and close are available, but as soon as I start, oh, you know what, I reverted. Now I'm on a new record, yes. As soon as I type the J, save on the menu is available. And in fact, save, a number of the items on the toolbar are actually drawing their enable, disable right out of the menu. I'm not demoing that in this session, but I guess I'll find a way to get this code to you, and that code is in there. So let's look at how all that is working. There's actually a lot of pieces of code involved here. So let's take it one at a time. First, we'll go back to the checkbox. The same is true for all the base classes. Interactive change uses raise event, and what it raises is a custom method or a custom event that I've added called any change. Programmatic change has exactly the same code. The custom any change method has nothing here because this is abstract. We'll put code in it at the in the actual controls or in subclasses. The other thing going on in this class is it has a custom property, lNote change. This property set it is intended to let you say, should I pay attention to changes to this control? Because not every control on a form is something that should determine whether you can save the form at this point or how the menu and toolbar should behave. Some of the controls on a form are about managing the form. For example, on that borrower form, I didn't demo it, but there's a combo box. The combo box is for selecting existing members. So a change in the combo box shouldn't change the state of the menu. But a change in that text box for the first name should. So, lNote change lets me determine for an individual control, is it relevant to the enable-disable status of the menu? All right, so that's going on in all of these control classes, not just the checkbox. The form then has a number of things going on. It also has a property related to this called lNote user changes. For this form, should we be tracking user changes? Why wouldn't we? Well, maybe we've got a dialogue. And in the dialogue, the menu isn't relevant. So we get to determine at the form level, are we even interested in doing this? Then, in the init of the form, we have a block of code down here. If this .lNote user changes, this .bind control events, passing this as a parameter. So yes, this is another one that's recursive. Let's take a look at it. Bind control events receives an object parameter and loops through the objects within that, whatever it receives. If the control that we're looking at, we're going to look at each control in the objects collection. If that control has an lNote change property, and that property is true, then bind the controls any change method to the form's custom any change method. And then drill down recursively so that we go all the way to the bottom and everything on the form gets bound. Or everything on the form that has this property and the property is set to true. Okay, so what's in the form's any change method? At this level, not much. There's a custom property, LDataChanged, that's tracking whether any data on the form has changed. So when any change fires, we set that to true, and then we call a method updateEnabled, which we're going to use to update whether things are enabled. This one, activate menu, main menu, no wait. We want to immediately reevaluate the skip for conditions of the menu. Ordinarily, they wouldn't get reevaluated until we click on a menu item. One of the reasons I want to evaluate them right away is that I'm controlling the enable, disable status of toolbar items based on the menu. So I need to evaluate it right away. I do that by activating the menu, no wait, so we don't sit there. The form might have a custom menu pad. If it does, do the same thing for that custom menu pad, and then call this method, form update enabled. This is abstract at this level. There's no code in the base class. But in individual forms, that's where we're going to control sorry, let me try not to use the word control. That's where we're going to determine which controls on the form are enabled and disabled, and I'll show you that for the borrower form. So here's the borrower form. And form update enabled. We're just making the usual kind of decisions about what is the state of this form, which controls on the form should be enabled and which should be disabled. All right, and then the final piece of this puzzle is the menu, where we have, for example, on save, a skip for condition, and the skip for condition is if we're going to skip if there's no active form, that's the first condition, or we're going to skip if the active form does not have a data changed property, LData changed, or we're going to skip, that is, we're going to disable this menu item if that data changed property is false, not LData changed. So we're going to set the save, we're going to disable the save item on the menu if there's no active form, or if the active form doesn't have our custom LData changed property, or if it has that property but the property is false, meaning no data has changed on the active form. Okay, so that's how it all ties together. And as I said, there's some more code in here. It's not really related to bind events and stuff, so I'm not showing it. That filters those skip for conditions. Okay. This is one that I had tried to figure out how to do years before we had bind event and couldn't come up with a way to do it, but bind event makes this easy. And this is, if you've ever wanted to have your application do something when the user doesn't do anything. I was working on an application some years ago where what the customer wanted was if the user didn't do anything for 10 seconds, we should begin some background activity. And then as soon as the user did anything, moved the mouse or typed a key, we should stop the background activity. And bind event makes that possible. Bind key press and mouse move to a method of a timer, and that allows us to know when the user is active and when the user is not active. And I probably should have switched sooner because now I'm going to have to vamp a little bit while I demo this. I have a preferences form here, and I don't know how readable this is for you, but I'm checking the one that says close after 1 minute of inactivity, and I'm going to hit OK, and then I'm going to take my hands off of everything and wait a while and vamp a little bit. Because this is another of those things I get asked about. People want a way to shut the application down when the user hasn't done anything for a while. And while I wouldn't actually use 1 minute of inactivity in a real application as the standard, this does let us demo this, assuming that a minute will pass eventually. I'm vamping here, and I can't even go unmute you guys to see if there are questions because I'd have to move the mouse to do that. So I'll just keep talking a little bit longer, waiting for this to happen. What's going to happen is a message box will come up that says, you don't seem to be doing anything. Do you want to shut down? And of course, that would not be terribly useful, except that I put a timeout on that. It's actually an input box. And I put a timeout on it so that, no, it's actually a message box. I'm wrong. There we go. So do you want to shut down this application? I'm going to say no, because I don't. And I'm going to turn that off so it doesn't come along and do it while I'm showing you how it works. So now let's take a look at the code behind that. All right, this is another where we have some code in the init of our form base class. You've maybe starting to notice there's a lot going on in that init. This one is if L bind user action. So again, I've got a custom property that determines whether I want this behavior. If so, I'm going to call the bind user actions method of the form. And bind user actions actually passes this off to the application object. If we've got an activity timer attached to our application object, call the application object bind user actions method, passing the form as a parameter. And let me use the document view to help me find the method I want. So bind user actions receives an object as parameter, and we have an application level track user activity property. If we're interested in tracking user activity at this time, and at the application level, we're going to make sure we have the activity timer. And I know this contradicts what was in the form, where I didn't do this unless I had the activity timer, but this is a little more generic. And then call the bind user action in object method of that timer, again, passing the object along. So we're going to switch over here. So we have the user activity timer class, timer user activity, and it has this method, bind user action in object, and it takes the object it was passed, says, does it have a key press method? If so, bind that key press method to the user activity method of the timer. And I think this may be the first example where I'm actually binding to a method with a different name. And I realize I may have given a misimpression that they had to have the same name. They don't. And this example shows it. Move. If there's a mouse move method on the object, bind it to the user activity method of the timer. Note that I've now got two different methods of the same object bound to one method of the event handler. That's permitted. And then, no surprise, drill down, because we want to bind every control so that we see every movement or every key press. So what does the user activity method do? Well, the first thing it does is have parameters. Why? Because the delegate method receives the same parameters as the bound event. So if the bound event receives parameters, we need to make sure we have somewhere to grab them. And in this case, since one of the events we're binding to is mouse moves expects 4 parameters, so I need to have 4 parameters here. Yes, I could use them. I'm not doing so here, and I don't know that I have an example where I do, but certainly you can use them. And this is one of the things that makes bind event very nice, because the parameters come along for free. So in this, and this is a first level class here. By that I mean this is the generic version of the user activity timer, and then I'll subclass it to do particular things. In this case, all we do is set a custom property that the user acted to true, and then we reset the timer. So every time the user hits a key or moves the mouse, the timer gets reset so it doesn't reach whatever its interval is. But what happens when it finally does reach its interval? Well, here all I do is set that flag, LUser acted, to false. And because, as I say, this is sort of the generic version, let's go look at a specific version. The subclass here, the one that we actually are using in the application, is timer shutdown. And I have to get a little bit ahead of myself here, because I'm actually using an assign method to take action when the timer fires, or when it doesn't. In this case, when it does. We'll talk about assign methods soon, but the basic idea is every time we change the value of the LUser acted property, this method fires and the new value is passed in. So here, if not the new value, that is, if LUser acted was set to false, then I was right, it was an input box. I was also wrong because I said it was a message box. So I prompt the user, and there's a timeout here. And if the response we get back is yes, then we call a method that shuts the application down. And then at the end here, and I guess we won't get here if we shut down the application, I save the value, which we'll talk about what that means for assigned methods a little bit later. So again, a lot of parts here, but these are all parts that you would write in your classes. The only code here that wouldn't have been something that you had before you started actually writing the application was the last bit, the timer shutdown. Everything else was either in the base classes or in the generic timer class that we set up here. Okay, another example, or another thing you can do. Take update on a form action. What am I talking about here? When one form calls another form and the second form is modal, it's no big deal to update that first form when you close the modal form, or when you do certain things on the modal form. Sometimes, though, you might have two forms open and neither of them is modal. And even if one called the other, if it's not modal, how can you update the first form based on something that happened in the second form? And the answer is bind event. If I show you an example, it'll make more sense. So let me do that. So here, this is the library application again. And if I have the checkout form open and I choose one of my members, and you can see here that we have information about the member. If I right-click and choose Show This Member's Record, it opens the borrower form, and you can see that we're looking at the data for the same member. And let's say we just learned that the last 4 digits of the zip code are these digits. Watch the address box in the checkout form when I click Save. It got updated when I saved from here. That's non-trivial, right? I know that it's very weird for me to have no feedback as I talk. So let's go look at how that's done. There's not actually a whole lot of code for that. So if I go look at let's open it again, the checkout form. That right-click calls a custom show borrower method of the form. And what does it do? It does a do form, passing in the borrower number, and it uses the name clause so that I get an object reference back to the form. Then, right here, I check, did it actually work? Did I get back an object? It's not null. And if that's the case, then I use bind event to the borrower form's destroy method, bind the destroy method of the borrower form to the refresh member method of this form, and do the same thing for the save method of the borrower form. So I have a custom save method. So when either of those fires, we're going to run the refresh method here, except here's something we haven't seen before, this last parameter of 1.
Okay, Tamar, I'll give you the cool now.
What?
I'll give you a cool now. This looks very slick.
Yeah, it really is. Thank you. So here, the 1 here says, run the bound event first, then run the delegate method, because we need to do the save first before we refresh the member. And I guess I should say that one of the things about this application is it's designed so that when you close a form, it automatically saves changes. So that's why binding destroy works, because the save will happen at that point, and then we'll refresh the member. And the refresh member does what you'd expect. It calls another method that looks up the member. And we don't need to look at that code. It's not really relevant here. Okay. So one more bind event.
Quick question related to that.
Sure.
What happens if your form with the refresh member is closed first?
The binding goes away because as soon as either object that is involved in a bind event goes out of scope, the binding disappears.
Okay.
Which is exactly what you want in this case. Okay, so one more event binding example, and this one is quite different because in VFP 9 we got an additional ability. We can not only bind FoxPro events, we can bind window events to FoxPro methods. Windows events, I should say. And that means that your application can respond when something happens in Windows. The example I'm going to show is with colors because colors make really nice examples. But imagine having your application respond when, say, the battery warning in Windows occurs. And you get the one that says 10% left and we're going to shut down real soon. And imagine having your application save all or prompt the user to save data or just do it automatically when that happens. So there's lots of other interesting Windows events you can bind to. The syntax is a little different. You pass either a window handle or 0, and then in Windows, events don't have names, they have numbers. They're called messages and they have message numbers. So you pass the message you're interested in, and then these two are the same. The name of the event, or the object that is the event handler, and the name of the delegate method. So one of the things that I like to do is be sensitive to the user's color scheme. I don't know if you've noticed, but in these forms, there's some slightly non-standard things going on color-wise, like this message that's sort of in a pale blue. I actually pulled that blue out of the color scheme. It's actually the highlight color in the color scheme. And this gray, that background color, is also a color from the color scheme, from the user's color scheme. And what that means is I better be able to do something when the user changes colors. And what I don't know if I can do at this moment, I'm going to the desktop, and I don't know if I can show you the desktop. I don't see a way to switch to that. But what I'm going to do in the desktop, and I'll just talk it through, is I am going to change the highlight color in Windows. This is much less interesting when you can't see me doing it, but you'll see the result. I'm going to change the selected items color in my Windows color scheme to a hot pink. And if all is well, when I come back over here, look at that. That changed to hot pink. Okay. I'm going to change it back only because I know we don't really want to look at hot pink. Actually, I can do this much more easily. I can just go back to my normal scheme. All right, now I went back to my normal color scheme. So how did I do this? Hello? Where did I lose? There it is. Okay. So I have a class that manages color stuff for me. And I'm not going to show you everything about it. I'll just tell you that it pulls the colors out of Windows and handles that for me. I have a method called bind color changes. And bind color changes is where I'm going to set up this binding. This part that I'm highlighting is an oracle. And what I mean by that is you can copy this code exactly as it is wherever you want to bind a Windows event. And I don't actually know exactly what it does. I just know that it makes it work. the key lines here, the ones I have to pay attention to are the bind event. I'm going to bind the window handle of the underscore VFP window to this Windows event, which is theme changed. And I'm going to bind that event to the handle theme change method of my custom class here. And I'm going to do the same thing for the sys color change event of Windows. Bind that to the handle theme change method. When that happens, when there's a theme change, here's my handle when it fires. Handle theme change has a little bit more of Oracle code, that's Oracle in quotes, this much of it. This is do default at the Windows level. This ensures that Windows actually runs the code that it needs to run, and you need to have this in your event handler, your delegate method. Once I've done that, I call a read user colors method, and read user colors goes out to Windows and says, tell me about your colors. I'm keeping them in a collection. So what I'm doing in here, without going through all the details, is I've got a list of color names in a cursor, and for each one I'm calling the getSysColor API function, and then I'm adding an object to a collection with the name of the color and the actual color value, the RGB value. So that's all that's going on there. So the other piece of this is what's going on in, big surprise, the form base class. Back to that very busy init method. First, we need to make sure we have this getUserColors class. Now, if the application is already instantiated, it will just share. There's no reason to have a copy in every form. And then we call the getUserColors method of this class. We'll look at that in a minute. And then we bind the readUserColors method or event of the color object to the getUserColors method of the form. And this is another case where we do it after. That is, we need to read the user colors before we do things at the form level that are going to use those colors. And what do we do at the form level? We go into that colors object and we ask it for these three colors, app workspace, window, and highlight, and we store them to form properties. So these are custom properties of the form. The one we're going to look at is an highlight color. It's the highlight color from Windows. So the one last piece of this is the actual control that uses it. I have a subclass of my label base class called label highlight. And label highlight, well, it has this set highlight color method. If the form has an nHighlight color property, set the forecolor of this control to that property. In the init method, we're doing a little bit of work. We are setting it the first time, and then we bind so that every time the highlight color nHighlight color property of the form fires, something new. We can actually bind properties so that every time this property changes, we execute this method, this delegate method. And again, afterward, in this case, we need the highlight color to get set first so that we can then grab it and use it for this control. Again, this looks like a lot of code, but all of it's in your framework, if you will. It's all code you've written once, and you don't have, in this case, all you have to do to make this work is drop the label highlight control on your form instead of your base label class. And you might consider, rather than doing it that way, I made it a subclass. You might actually build this right into your base label class and just have a property that controls whether it uses the highlight color or the normal colors. Okay, that is the end of the bind event part of the session. So let me...
The conference is now in conversation mode.
And take any questions about bind event before I move on to access and assign.
Let me turn my mic on too so you can hear me. I'm thinking about like that first example where you had the show menu command and it was the right click. So in every control, I've got a bind event in there to set up the binding.
Right, in the base classes.
But I could just as easily have in the right click of one of my base classes called this form.show menu and passed it to this, couldn't I?
Yeah, you would have to be sure to pass it the object reference. I think one of the advantages with bind event is I can generically use A events to find out where I am. But yes, you could.
Okay. The A events, though, will tell me more of what's going on and where it came from.
Yeah. As I say, it gives you that nice generic. You do need some code at the base level. Although technically, you could have, rather than have the binding in all the control classes, you could be handling it at the form level. If your forms are static, if you're not adding controls at runtime, you could have the form go through and bind the right click of everything on it the same way I bound all the other stuff. In which case you wouldn't have to have anything in the control classes. In the application where I'm using this stuff, that wouldn't work because I actually am adding things dynamically. Any other questions at this point? Okay, let me unmute you so we don't hear people's email and dinner.
The conference is now in presentation mode.
I said that backwards. I muted you all again. Okay, let me go back and we'll go on and talk about access and assign methods. So these came into the language in VFP 6, and they're something that every property can have. Every property can have an access method. Every property can have I'll talk about the assign method first in the overview because it's a little easier. It fires whenever the property is assigned a value, whether that happens interactively or through code. If the property value changes, the assign method fires. The access method fires anytime there's a reference to the property. That is, anytime you need the value of the property, the access method fires. And that gives you some interesting capabilities, and we'll talk about access first. The first is sort of generic, the idea of just-in-time updating. If you have something that can be updated various ways, well, there are two different pieces here. One is the case where, for example, you have some running total. It's the total of 6 or 8 different things. You could write code to update that every time you change one of those 6 or 8 things. Or you could give it an access method so that you actually compute that total at the moment that you need it. The example I'm going to use here is to handle the case where maybe you don't always remember to set something up. For example, as it says, determining the first control on a form. The case is that you have something set up, and we're going to look at, and I don't actually have there's not really a visual example for this, but I have a form, a subclass of my form base class that I call form BizObj aware. This is a form that's designed to work with business objects, do data entry kinds of things. And so it has a property that I've scrolled right past called see first control. And this is the name of the control that should get focused, for example, after the user clicks new. This is where we want control to land at the user can start entering data. And because I don't always remember to set properties like this when I'm creating a form, I have an access method. And the access method is going to assume that if I haven't bothered to set it, then what I want is the first control in tab order to get focus at that point. So when we try to use see first control, we come in here, and if it doesn't have a value, if it already has a value, then just skip over all this, return the value, and move on. And I guess I didn't say explicitly, whatever the access method returns is what is used in the place where the property was accessed. So if I say some variable equals this dot some property, and the some property underscore access method returns a value that has nothing to do with what's stored in the property, that's legal. And that's what will get used. That's what will get assigned to the variable. So here, anyway, what's going on here, if we don't already have a value, I set this low tab number to something absurdly high. I think that's 1,000,000. And I loop through all the controls. If it has a tab index and a set focus method, then if its tab index is less than the lowest one I found so far, then this is the lowest one so far, and the lowest tab index is the tab index of this control. Loop through all the controls, and when I'm done, low control is the one with the lowest tab index. So I grab its name, I put that into the property, and I return that value. And of course, accessing the property in the access method does not fire the access method. So then the new method of the form, my custom new method, does a bunch of stuff around creating a new object to work with, a new record. And once it has done all that, it evaluates the see first control property of the form. This is, by the way, my favorite way of handling the situation where I have the name of an object stored and I need a reference to it. I will evaluate this dot plus that name. So I get an object reference to the control I want, and I set focus to it. So just in time updating. What else can we do with access methods? Dynamic tooltips. The same application I've mentioned a couple of times has certain objects in the form where we want to be able to hold the mouse over them and find out the current status of that object. And what I'm using to do that is an access method for tooltip text, runs the code to build the tooltip, and then returns that, and that's what we display. And the slide shows an example. I'm not sure I actually need to go over to demo it in the application as well, because you can see we're sitting in this catalog form, and the tooltip here is information about this book. And I'll confess now, this is one I added for this session. I think in the real application, I wouldn't make this a tooltip. This information would just be on this page. But it's a nice demo because obviously this is stuff I had to compute at this moment. So let's go look at that code. We have that information on that page of the catalog is in a container. And the container has a tooltip text access method. And what does it do? It calls a method of the form get book detail, passing the barcode for this book. And get book detail is what actually build, oh great, it's at the form level. And we're not in the form. Here's get book detail. It receives a barcode as parameter, and the way the application works, there's already, when we're here, a cursor status that has information about the current book. So if the member ID is null, then we know that it's not checked out. Otherwise, and I don't want to go through how these business objects work, but we go through. See, we're slowly building see book info, adding things to it, and eventually we return this string that we've built up. Continuing on the tooltip theme, another thing you can do with
Tamar, can I interrupt you?
Sure.
When does that access method then fire?
The access method fires when you are referencing the property. Now, on a tooltip text, when is that referenced? It's referenced when you hover the mouse over the object and need the tooltip.
Okay, so in that case, it's actually FoxPro itself is accessing the tooltip property.
Correct, the tooltip text, yeah.
And fires it off.
And fires it, right. Which is actually a nice example of that access works not just for code.
Yeah. If you're moving your mouse in that container, are you continuously firing that access method?
No, because tooltip text is only evaluated when you stop and hover. There's a delay.
Oh, right. Okay.
Okay. And we're going to continue this example because that same container, and I'll back up for a second, but I'll go over and demo this. Here you notice the mouse is over an empty space. But in fact, I can get this tooltip hovering over any of the controls inside that container. I'll show you that. Because I have an access method for the controls themselves that under certain circumstances, the tooltip text access method will return the parent's tooltip text. If the container is transparent. Let me switch over to the library application. And of course, that's the form I don't have open, but we'll open it. Okay, so here's the book, and this is what we just saw the code for. But what if I stop here over the edit box? I'm still getting the same thing. So how does that work? If I look at, might as well do it with the edit box since that's what we looked at. The tooltip text access method for this edit box takes a look at whatever the parent of the edit box is, and if it has an lbind tooltip method and that property rather, and that property is true, then we return the tooltip text from the parent. Otherwise, we return the tooltip text from this control, which of course might be empty. So fairly simple code, but it's another thing we're doing that makes containers invisible. Also, this is another thing where by setting it up with a property, all I have to do when I actually create the form is set the properties the way I want them to behave. I don't have to go in and make lots of changes, just set a few properties. Yet another tooltip example. There's a bug in, I think, every version except VFP9 SP1. And the bug is that when you're in a grid and hover the mouse, you get the tooltip from the grid rather than from the control that you're over in the grid. They fixed it in SP1 and broke it again in SP2. So let me demonstrate. I'm going to demonstrate the fix, not the workaround, not the bug. Pick up that checkout form again. Choose somebody. And I need one that's available. Okay, and obviously what I would like is when I hover over this delete button, I want this tooltip. And without some extra work, you won't actually get the tooltip for the button. Fortunately, you can do the work and make that happen. And here's how you do it. In the grid base class, I have a tooltip text access method. And the first thing I do is the same code we had in the edit box. If the parent says use my tooltip, we use the parent's tooltip. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and let the things inside the grid have their own tooltips. So we use a mouse obj, very nice function, to find out where we are. And we assume we're over a column, and then we actually check. If we're over a column, then grab the column's tooltip text in case the control itself doesn't have any. But then go ahead and evaluate, find out what is the current control in this column, and if it has something in its tooltip text, return that. So what we've got is a nice hierarchy here. We can have tooltip now at the grid level, at the column level, and at the control level, and we'll return something. And that's how that works. Okay. The examples for access.
The conference is now in conversation mode.
Questions about access methods. Okay, then I'll go on and talk about assign methods. We are getting near the end, folks. I know it's getting late, at least in the East.
The conference is now in presentation mode.
Okay, one of my favorite things that I figured out to do with an assign method is to set a dirty flag, to have some idea, to know at the application level that there are changes that haven't yet been saved. And I also then use this to set a dirty indicator, like as shown on the slide. One of the things I really like in VFP is when I'm working in a code window, it tells me if I have unsaved code with this little asterisk. So I thought that would be a nice thing to have in my applications. And you can see it, or you can't see it yet until I make this switch. But right here in the checkout window, right, the asterisk says, oh, we have unsaved changes. And if I save that, I don't know what happened to my toolbar. Now that went away. No more unsaved changes. There's also some stuff happening application level here. So let's go over and take a look at the underlying code. Back in the form-based class, we looked at this before, the LData changed property. This was the custom property, and we were setting this when the user made a change. Well, now we're going to find out what we do with it. We have an assign method for it. And when that property is changed, first thing we do is go ahead and set it. In an assign method, I talked about how in an access method, you determine what value the caller sees for the property. In an assign method, you determine what the new value of the property is. Normally, you'll do what this line of code does. You'll go ahead and assign the value that was passed in to the property. But you don't have to do that, or you can do some calculations first. You might internally store the value in a different way than you pass into it. In this case, we just want to save the value that was passed in. Then, if we have an application object that's not null, and if it has a method called setDirtyFlag, call that method and pass this value, trying to determine whether there are unsaved changes in the application. Then we want to update the form caption. So if the value that came in was true, that is, data has changed, then if the form caption doesn't end with an asterisk, add the asterisk. If the value that came in was false, there is no there's no changed data in this form, then if we already have the asterisk there, remove it. Simple code. Let's go look at that setDirtyFlag property in the application. Okay, so setDirtyFlag, this is an application level property. In this library application, I'm not really doing anything with it. I added this for demonstration purposes. But a lot of us have written applications where when the user shuts down, we want to prompt and say, do you want to save whatever? And I figured this technique out because I inherited an application that prompted for that every time you closed it, whether or not there was unsaved data, and I found that very unsatisfying. So the form calls this method passing in either true or false. That is, it either has or does not have changed data. If the form passed true in, then we know that the application has unsaved data, so we just set an application level property, L unsaved data, to true. That's the easy case. If the form sends false, all we know is that that form doesn't have any unsaved data, but we don't know whether any other forms do. So we're going to have to loop. We set the form, the application property to false, and then loop through all the open forms. And for each form, if it has an LData changed property, check the value of that property. If it's true, set the application level flag to true, and then we're done here, because as soon as we find one form with unchanged data, unsaved data, I'm sorry, then we know that the application has unsaved data, and we can just get out of this method. So a way to make your application smart, or another way, because I think a lot of these I've shown have been ways to make your application smart. Another thing that we can do with an assign method is delegate the handling of a new value. That is, we can pass off what we need to do to somebody else who knows more about it. Or we can, as it says here, let you take an action automatically. I showed earlier the preferences form for the library application. I'll open it up again. And we didn't talk about how am I doing that. We talked about how the inactivity thing works, but I didn't talk about what I was doing to set it if the user makes the change. So let's go ahead and look at what's going on underneath that. I'm going to open the preferences form. So the preferences form has a make changes method. No, let me start actually with the button. When the OK button fires, there's code in it that says if the form has a make changes method, call that. This is from my generic dialog form. So the make changes method here, and we're going to look at the second case here, the one for the timer, says if there's an application object and it has an LTrack user activity property, then I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong method. I knew that didn't make sense. Here we go. Try this one. Application object has this property, and if the value of the checkbox is not the same as that property, then set that property to the value of the checkbox. And then we do something very similar for the spinner that determines how many minutes of inactivity. The difference here is I multiply by 60,000 because timers operate in milliseconds, and I didn't think we needed control over this anything lower than minutes. Okay, so we're changing two application level properties here. So what's going on at the application level? We have an assign method for each of them. So all I have to do in the form is set the appropriate property, and then I let the application handle it. So the assign method for LTrack user activity, it receives either true or false. It confirms it got a logical value and that the new value is different than what was in the property already. And if that's the case, set the property to the new value, and then if it's true, set up the activity timer. If it's false, disable the activity timer. And then the other one, which should be right underneath, yes, for the interval of the activity timer, same idea. If we got a numeric value that's positive and it's different than the interval now, set this property of the application, and also go to the activity timer itself and set its interval property to the new value. So what I did here was allow the preferences form to be reasonably stupid. All the preferences form knows is the name of properties to set based on the changes. Then I'm letting the application object be the smart thing that knows what to do about those. I don't want the preferences form to have to know about the activity timer. That makes me really uncomfortable. Okay. Another thing that we can do with assign methods, and this may be the prototypical thing to do with an assign method, is check for validity. So test the value it receives and reject an invalid value. And I don't have an example to show you from the library application, but I wrote an application for a different session a few years ago. It was a Sudoku game. And it has a property called nsize, the game business object does. And those of you who know Sudoku know that Sudoku games are square. So the nsize property has an assign method that checks, was the value that was passed in a perfect square? Is the square root of the value the same as the integer of the square root of the value? If it is, accept it. Otherwise, ignore it. We've talked a lot in this session. I've talked a lot about containers and doing things to make them invisible, manage them, things like that. One of the things you can do with an assign method is propagate data inside a container. If you have some property of the container and you would like everything inside it to be the same, to have the same value for the corresponding property, give an assign method to the container to loop through the contained objects to assign that value. The example I'm going to show you is with the tooltip, a different approach to tooltips than what we saw with access methods. But I've also done this with back color. If I want everything in the container to have the same back color, then I can use an assign method of the container's back color. And when that changes, propagate it down to everything inside the container. We're just going to look at code here. It's actually the tooltip example. In the container base class, we already looked at the tooltip, or we have the tooltip access methods. It's the same as for all the other controls, but the assign method is doing something a little bit different. The container has a flag, lpropagate tooltip down, and if it's true, loop through all the controls, all the objects in this container, and all the ones that have tooltip text, set it to the same value as we have here. This is static. The stuff we saw with the access method was when you need dynamic tooltips. For static tooltips, If you want everything in the container the same, just pass it on down. And that's the last example for a sign. Let me go ahead, since I just have one more slide, and talk about debugging a little bit, and then I'll take any other questions. When you have bind events, access, and assign, debugging gets a little bit harder because things seem to happen magically. And the real answer to how you debug these things is systematically. Not, for me, not terribly differently than how I debug anything else. The debug out command, which allows you to send information to the debug output window of the debugger, is really handy. There were a couple of places along the way where you may have seen a debug out in my code from when I was still trying to get it working. So debug out, scatter them freely, and what I love about debug out is if you don't remove them, the user doesn't see them, because debug out only happens in the IDE and only when the debugger is open. So unlike wait windows, you don't have to clean them out. The trace window is very much your friend. If you don't know what's happening, step through the code in trace. It's a great way to understand what's firing when. And in conjunction with that, I keep always in my watch window the line no function. Because when I'm really baffled or I need to make the code stop now, I put a breakpoint on line no. And it stops executing as soon as the next line of code comes along. So you don't understand how you're getting where you're getting. Put a breakpoint on line no, do whatever it is that's causing trouble, and you will stop on the next line of code. The A events function is another thing that can be helpful when you're trying to understand what's going on with event binding. If you don't know where you are, how did you get here, use A events and look at the results, and maybe it will give you a clue. Also, not on the slide, but handy, is the event tracking capability of the debugger. Turn on event tracking to help you see what's firing in what order. And since event tracking goes to the debug output window, you can combine it with debug out statements that'll give you an even better picture of what is going on. So at this point, the summary is that bind event, access, and assign let you do lots of set it and forget it. Set this stuff up, and when you build forms, all you have to do is tweak, turn the right flags on, use the right classes, and lots of things will happen, and your application will look smart, look better, and behave smarter.
The conference is now in conversation mode.
Any remaining questions?
Hello, Tamar.
Yeah.
This is Randy from Chicago.
Hi, Randy.
Hi, back about halfway through the slide deck, you had bind the key press and mouse move to, I believe it was application timer.
Yes.
Okay, just wanted to check that the note I scribbled to myself was correct.
Yeah,
Tamar,
I can go back.
Yeah, and can you repeat what he said? We're losing it in the echo.
Ah, okay, yeah, he was asking about, I want to go back, hang on, I want to just go back to that slide. This one. Right, what I did here, the question was about this example, where I bound the key press and the mouse move of everything under the sun to an application level timer. And what that let me do was keep track of whether the user has done anything, so that I could either do a background activity or shut down the application or whatever it was that I want to do because the user isn't doing anything.
Thanks for bringing that up again. Just needed to refresh my note on getting that right. Looks like something I'll be able to use.
Okay, and as I'll make all this code available. I'm sure Todd will let me know how I do that. So,
All right, thank you.
okay. Any other questions?
Speak now or hold your peace. Okay, thanks, Tamar.
Great. Well, thank you all. This was a lot of fun. I said this earlier. I love this session.
We've got to find a way to do virtual applause.
Okay, I'm going to hand this back to you, if I can remember how.
I can just cancel you.
There we go. I got you.